seeing Black women in positions of power where they can bring people up after them as well. That's where I think equality can be, where we can be in positions to create change and create new policies that will benefit not only ourselves, but for everyone. Because when we are marginalized and being silenced, there are many people who are being marginalized and silenced.
It's been really heavy to watch the dehumanization of immigrants to the point where there's hysterectomies and there's children in cages and there's literally no pathway to citizenship for us. There's nothing, there's just this no status, almost subhuman place in this country for us. And that's something that I wish would change.
I think thoughts and prayers are at this point futile. I think that you have to put in place action if you actually want to change the society that we live in. So I would ask, do you have people of color in your offices, on your advising teams? Are you amplifying voices of color? Are you actually listening? When decisions are being made that are going to affect communities of color, there need to be people of that community in the room. There's treatment of the symptomatic issues of systemic racism without treatment of systemic racism as a whole. So we see elected officials upset about looting, riots, things that are happening in our communities, our increased crime rate, but there is not any money or energy going towards mental health resources, going towards arresting cops that are actually murdering Black people. Those are the core issues. We see no movement from Congress, no movement from the executive branch, no movement from the judicial branch. I deserve to be angry about these issues that are affecting me and my family and the people that I love.
I see a lot of people talking about redefining liberation. What is liberation? And everyone keeps having this democratic dream of the American dream, and that hasn't been afforded to Black women or the Black collective as a whole. When Black people make mistakes, or from what I've seen in my own individual experience, it doesn't end well. Either it ends in them going to jail, or them there's a lot of hypervigilance and surveillance and social control that goes on systemically and institutionally. So I feel like we're held accountable or held to a different standard.
There are possible ways to dismantle systemic racism. I would say that the United States spends twice as much on law and order, prisons, courts, police forces, as we do on cash welfare programs such as food stamps and temporary assistance for needy families. And the events of this year highlight the urgency of fixing that imbalance.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the YWCA Racial Justice Lunch and Learn. I'm Leah Merritt, President and CEO of YWCA Mahoning Valley. And we're happy to bring you this first of many more Lunch and Learn events with speakers, book reviews, and featured community partnerships focused on racial justice. The YWCA has been on the forefront of racial equity and social justice work for a very long time. Eliminating racism, empowering women are not just words, they're our mission. especially when it comes to the intersectionality of gender and race. You heard that wonderful video produced by YWCA USA. They had a young women of color listening session, and that was the result of that. We hear the disparate statistics and poor outcomes of Black, Indigenous, people of color. However, it is the women of color who are the most impacted, and we must focus here first to solve racism. Thank you to our sponsor, the Martini Martin Arts Foundation, which has allowed us to bring a great speaker to kick off our series today. And today we're excited to hear from Margaret Mitchell on race in America. And before I formally introduce Margaret today, some housekeeping. This is a Zoom webinar, so you're all muted and off camera except for the speakers, but we do encourage you to use the chat feature to enter comments or questions for Margaret or the YWCA Mahoning Valley. And we want to know where everyone is joining us today, so if you've not already entered that information in the chat box, please do so. I'd like to give a shout out and thank you to all who are attending today. We had close to 180 people sign up, so we're very happy about that. And we also want to thank our Ohio Council of YWCAs, our YWCA Mahoning Valley board members, and representatives from the YWCA USA who are here today. And we are collectively working together towards peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all through this work. So now we're going to learn a little bit about our speaker. I've known Margaret Mitchell through the YWCA for some time, and her vision and persistence are invigorating. And I've enjoyed working alongside of her and learning from her, and she is truly a fearless leader, and I'm so proud to know her. Her formal bio reads, Margaret Mitchell is a relational leader who anticipates trends and has a proven track record of creating competitive breakthrough strategies. She communicates complex issues with vision and purpose through her core values. She's a consistent top performer who pursues growth with energy and drive. Margaret is a strong decision maker who builds consensus and strives for personal and organizational excellence. She skillfully develops and coaches others and is recognized for her savvy ability to build and maintain relationships with children, youth, families, and peoples from all walks of life. Margaret joined the YWCA of Greater Cleveland in May of 2011 by a unanimous vote of the board of directors in the capacity of president and CEO. She was recruited to the YWCA as a change agent to energize the strategic vision and elevate organizational relevance and reputation. Under her leadership, YWCA Greater Cleveland transformed its traditional preschool into an unduplicated, trauma-informed therapeutic model serving homeless families with children ages 3 to 5. Leads a community-level collective impact collaboration to prevent and end youth homelessness in Greater Cleveland and put the organization on track to financial health, reversing decades of deficit funding. Margaret, where do you find the time for all of this? Prior to the YWCA, Margaret served as the president and CEO of Big Brothers Big Sisters of Greater Cleveland, where she took an ailing nonprofit and turned that around under the board of directors and grew revenue reserves and transformed the agency into a quality performance culture. Margaret moved to Cleveland in October of 2007 from Dallas, Texas, where she was vice president for Big Brothers Big Sisters Lone Star, the largest agency in the Big Brothers Big Sisters in the country. And during her tenure on the leadership team, she received the Board of the Year and Agency of the Year national honors. Margaret developed national African American male recruitment strategies still in place and served on the National Leadership Council as a founding member of the Diversity Committee. Before her career in nonprofit management, Margaret was the vice president of sales and marketing for Mentium Corporation and the global leader in talent development and corporate mentoring. Previous to her business career, she worked for the Associated Press, an award-winning journalist, managing editor of Today's Dallas Women's Magazine, and the author of more than 12 books. It's no surprise that Margaret was named the 2014 Power Player of the Year by Smart Business Magazine, a 2013 Woman Worth Watching by Diversity Journal magazine, and is a member of the Leadership Cleveland 2011 and in Council with Women. Most recently, Margaret was instrumental in YWCA Cleveland partnering with First Year Cleveland to present the groundbreaking event, 400 Years of Inequity, a Call to Action. That was in November of 2019, and this summit reviewed the history and the impact of 400 years of policies, practices, and systems that have resulted in the myriad of racial disparities in health, justice, and economics that affect African Americans today. It was there that the call to action was made to work towards declaring racism as a public health crisis. Through perseverance, Margaret worked with a coalition to engage the city and the county in this work. The effort was a success, and the city of Cleveland adopted the resolution in June of 2020, followed by Cuyahoga County in July of this past year. She's now focused on making that declaration transcend into actions that drive equity and dismantle systemic racism. Margaret is a graduate of Hampton University, is committed to her faith and her husband of 30 years. And Margaret and her husband are the parents of 3 young adults establishing their careers in engineering, nursing, and firefighting. Please help me welcome Margaret Mitchell.
Well, thank you. I can just say what a delight it is for me to be here and for Mahoning Valley to have me. Leah was one of the first women executives that I met with the YWCA, and we are dear friends. The YWCA in Ohio is very close, and these are ladies and these are friendships that literally lift me up, support me, encourage me, and particularly during a time like this when the work is so important, but the ground is not as fertile sometimes as we would like. So I'm just delighted to be here, and just so proud of my friend and my colleague, Leah Merritt. So thank you. Well, here we are. Race in America, understanding race in America. And what I wanted to do right off the bat was to just share some slides with you that I'm going to really use as a level set as I give my brief talk. And I want you to be thinking of your questions, and please put those in the chat, because Leah will come back and we'll have an opportunity to be able to respond to your questions. So Verada, if you could just sort of show us the first slide, slide 1, please. So, I want to say about the YWCA, our mission is eliminating racism and empowering women. And, we don't do diversity work. We don't do cultural competency work. Our work is really rooted in eliminating racism. And it has, it's been a path for us as an association to really find our way to what that means in the world today and what we're going to do about dismantling racism. And we certainly think that the YWCA, along with other incredible organizations in this community, have really found our voice. For some, they have found their voice recently, but for the YWCA, I would say we've really been on a very powerful journey over the last 3 or 4 years that has brought us to this place where we are able to be leaders in this work. Next slide, please. One thing about understanding race in America, if you are to understand race in America, you must understand slavery. And so often people say, slavery doesn't exist now, it was long ago, and all of these pieces. But if you're ever going to be able to really make those links between the past and the present, you must understand slavery. When you look at this slide, you realize that slavery lasted a long time. And then you tack on Jim Crow to that, which was essentially legalized slavery. You see that we get to nearly 350 years. And when you look at those years and the existence of Blacks in America, you recognize that we're talking about 86% of our existence here in America has been linked to slavery or Jim Crow. And literally 55, 56 years since the Civil Rights Act, do we really get to one man, one vote in America? So I want you to be able to keep this timeline with you as you are doing this work, and be sure that you are able to make connections in your own life to what existed, what we began to know and think of during slavery and Jim Crow, and what we see and how we live today. Next slide, Rhonda. I wanted to include this next slide for you because I want you to know that this is really personal for me. This is my life. And what you see here is a photograph of my dad's office. And you can see, as you look at this picture very carefully, this photo is taken, my mom guesses between, my mom who's 90, by the way, she guesses that this photo was taken between 1979 and 1983. Unfortunately, my dad is no longer with us. But my dad was a civil engineer for the Bureau of Reclamation, and they were responsible for dams and waterways and irrigation in California, where water is king. As you look at this photo, you see my father kneeling in the front row. Yep, that's my dad. And you also see at the other end, there is a young student from Thailand who is an intern for the summer. On the back of the photo, you really get all this detail. And everyone else in the photo is white. And one of the things I love about this photo is that my dad is wearing a suit. I don't know if you noticed that. And very few other men in this photograph are wearing a suit. You'll also notice that there's no women in this photograph. And it is really, it's a snapshot. So again, 1979, 1983, here we are. Not much has changed for so many workplaces. And now let's look at the last slide that I have for us today. And really, this slide begins to shape. Oh, there is one more. I think is there one more slide after this? I think so. This slide really is a definition of racism. And this slide comes from one of my favorites, Dr. Kamara Jones. If you haven't seen her speak, you can find her on YouTube. She's absolutely amazing. And so, racism as a public health crisis, which I will talk a little bit about, is really not a new thing. And you can find YouTube of Kamara Jones from 5 years ago, in which she's also really talking about this issue. But you see here that she calls racism a system of structuring opportunity. A system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on the social interpretation of how one looks, which we call race. It's an unfair disadvantage. Some individuals and for communities unfairly advantaged for individuals and communities, and it shapes this, and it saps the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. And that is Dr. Kamara Jones's definition of racism. And definitions are important, and they're so important as we think about how we frame language, why we think of things that way. We've sort of, another image is for us to think about poverty. When we think about poverty or say poverty, and people do big reports on poverty, sometimes we forget to be very, very explicit and understanding, as Edgar Villanova, the author of Decolonizing Wealth, says, poverty is the result of public policy and theft. I mean, poverty is the result of public policy and theft that is facilitated by white supremacy. Now, we often think of poverty as something that has happened to the individual or the individual's responsibility or fault. And yet being able to define poverty as the result of public policy and theft, it reframes it, and as does this definition of racism. All right, now the last slide. I think there's one. Is there one more slide with the boxes? Oh, did we miss one? Veranda, there was a slide that really, there it is. So I love this slide because, and this slide comes from the Health Policy Institute of Ohio, and this is about being able to advance equity. You're on this call because you are interested not only in understanding race in America, but in advancing equity. And you see that individuals, we have a role to play, as does state and local governments and public and private organizations. We've got to be able to work together. Without working together, we are not going to be able to advance equity. That is so incredibly critical to this work, advancing equity. And that will happen when we begin to look at our beliefs and actions around, literally around what we think of as racism, what we think of as race, what we think of as racial prejudice, and to be able to begin to pull apart these processes and these actions, these policies, these norms, the way we think culturally as a society. This is where we are. This is what is happening now, and what we have to continue in terms of the momentum. Okay, this is it. This is it for the slides. Thank you, Miranda. Thank you for sharing the slides. So if you recall, we started out looking at that 400 years. Last year in 2019 marked 400 years since the 1619 landing of a slave ship carrying about 20 individuals who would become slaves in this new land. It was not even America yet at that time. And while there were crossings before that, and there were slaves in what we would consider America or North America, and certainly the slave trade, which is so amazing that the American trade is really sort of the smallest piece. The largest trade, the largest trade of slaves, of chattel slavery, of taking people and enslaving them, the enslavement of others really happens, the largest amount really happens in South America. And followed behind South America, you will see the Caribbean. And then, of course, North America, which includes Canada. And so we have the United States and, of course, Canada in terms of North America and the slave trade. And so 1619 really is sort of that powerful, hey, this is the economic engine that we are going to move forward with in terms of slavery. This is a new land, new territory, and we have those who come, the white settlers who come, and they really begin to plot. Certainly you have indigenous Americans who are here, and then the addition of Black chattel slavery. And there is a real focus and concerted effort to focus in on dismantling all of that and to create a human hierarchy. You don't quite have races yet at this point, but what you have, which is really, really powerful to recognize, is that a sacred text is used as the basis for this chattel slavery and this human hierarchy, and that that sacred text is what we call the Bible today. So in Genesis 9 actually is really the chapter that is used where Noah has several sons. I'm drawing a blank on whether there are 6 or 7, but he has these sons, and these sons really populate the earth in the Old Testament. And one of the sons is cursed, and that son, Ham, has in many parts of the country, not in all, but in many parts of the country, it became to be known that that was the tribe of that blacks came from. And so you have this early commitment built on a sacred text that says this is biblical, and this is how we are going to move forward as a country. Today, of course, we see that Martin Luther King famously said that 11 o'clock on Sunday is the most segregated hour in the country. And I think he said that in the early 1960s. And here we are today. Yes, we do have lots of diverse and integrated places of worship. There's no question about that. But for the most part, we still today have a very segregated faith way of expressing our faith on Sunday. And you can track that back to slavery. I think the thing that most is amazing for me when I think about slavery and understanding that. And I went to West Africa for the first time in 1997, and a friend of mine who was she was the beauty editor for Essence magazine, and we were roommates in college. And she said to me, "Hey, I'm going to Africa on a press junket. Do you want to go?" And I was like, "Yes." I didn't have a passport. I didn't know what I was saying yes to. But on that trip, I had the first experience of being in a slave castle in West Africa, and it was overwhelming for me. Part of what was overwhelming was that when you are at slave castles, at least the ones I've been to, so maybe not all, but I have visited a few, and the slave castles I've been in, there's always a church. There's always a church. And of course, we know why. And I can remember sort of the guide talking about women, Black women, and how they would be pulled from these dungeons. And every time I've been in the dungeons or looked out on the point of no return with a group, someone has fainted because the energy, the atmosphere is that heavy. 200 million Africans died during the crossing over the 246 years. And so it is that the heaviness of that place, of those places, is really overwhelming. And consistently, regularly, it was a very common practice for Black women for African women to be pulled out, and they would be dipped into these deep, thin wells. They'd be dipped down and sort of dunked and dunked and dunked, and then they would be hoisted up, and they would be given to whoever happened to be sort of inhabitant of that slave castle at the time, whether it was the Portuguese or the Spanish, and they would be raped. And this would happen daily and and regularly. And today, and so, when you look at practices that existed in slavery, and then you look at what those practices were during the 1700s or the 1800s or the 1900s, right? And you begin to be able to trace, regardless of what we're talking about, from a time of slavery through contemporary times to now, and understand how what remains in terms of our voices being minimized, muted, fear, trauma, hate, racism, and how it all has to play. Black and brown and Indigenous women are raped at a much higher rate today than white women, and yet we have one of the lowest self-reporting. And there is a deep, deep history to that, and understanding that history is absolutely incredible. When we think about history, and when we think about the history of slavery, we can also look at criminal justice, and really understanding how, as race begins to come into play in sort of cementing that higher human hierarchy, and who's on top and who's on bottom, one of the pieces that is essential to understanding that hierarchy. Now, in the 1990s, under the Clinton administration, it was proven without a shadow of a doubt that while there are clearly feature differences between Leah Merritt and myself, we are 99.9 genetically the same. And that our external features are sort of these minor, pieces of the puzzle. And so this was proven. You can the Genome Project is interesting reading. You can find it on the web. There's a great executive summary, but if you want to dig into the other work, you certainly can. But as race is really sort of taking shape and form, the most interesting thing to me is that it was really considered good science. And part of that good science was clearly defining sort of attributes that went along with all of the races. Now, we understand today that race is a social construct. It is a social, political idea, but we cling to it. Is it the truth? It is not the truth. The Genome Project has said we are genetically the same, but we do cling to this idea that there are distinct races. And when you really begin looking at the attributes that are assigned to the races, they're absolutely fascinating and devastating. So, part of understanding that the science said that Blacks were intellectually dull, intellectually inferior, that we are prone to violence and criminality genetically. And so when you think about that happening several hundred years ago, and how that has played out, I mean, you can find works as recently as 2015 that sort of still subtly speak to this genetic thinking. But it really does have this amazing impact on how we think about the wealth gap, how we understand criminal justice, how we think about redlining and housing today. Of course, there is sort of, for the good of the people, you sort of, need to corral, and of course, this less intelligent, have to treat people, in a certain way. So it's amazing. It's just amazing what we have done, and how lies have perpetuated significant, trauma. My father, as I said before, was a civil engineer. My mother was a teacher, really sort of stepped in very late in her life to teach. I think it was when my brother and I got into college, she sort of ignited her career. But I remember my father coming home and regularly having to write HR letters and defend himself and his work consistently. He was, living and representing Black America as the only Black civil engineer in his office. And it was not without difficulty and challenge. And, my father had grown up in Goldsboro, North Carolina, which at the time he was growing up was an all Black incorporated town. So my family was the mayor and the publisher of the newspaper and, the fire chief, sort of had all of those jobs in this really sort of one horse town. And, I am stunned at the clarity my father had around his commitment to the Black community and understanding race and racism in America, and sort of passing that along to me in terms of the travel and the trips that we went on, the books that he read, the things that we watched, sort of the home education. But what was happening at school for me was really, quite a different experience. We are all socialized together, not to understand the slave trade. In fact, there are many history books today that you can pick up and read, where enslavement is sort of characterized as laborers. They were just laborers, and certainly a laborer sort of gives some connotation of choice. And we know this not to be true. So there is a very deep miseducation that has happened in America. And of course, growing up, I certainly experienced it. I'm thinking that you did too. And we, collectively, while I was getting this incredible education at home, there was a deep understanding that I was, second class. In fact, my mother recently sort of sent me my little book of all of my grades and educational things. And there was a year in the third grade where my mother and this teacher are writing back and forth to each other and meeting and phone calls, and it's all, my mother has documented it all. And basically this teacher is bullying me. And as you read in between the lines, clearly my parents have a deep understanding that I am being bullied by the teacher because of the color of my skin. And so it's a constant, it is a constant battle in this country. It is a battle, it is a burden, it is a attack, it's an onslaught simply because of the color of one's skin. Understanding race in America is understanding that it is racism that impacts and has devastated America. And, America will never be what she is meant to be until we tackle this. And tackling this is really, it is on that individual level, it is on that state and government level, and again, on private organizations. And so as you begin to think about what that looks like for you and how you do that, you've got to be able to see things, to see the inequities in order to be able to begin to change them and dismantle them. I know for me at the YWCA, and I've been there for 10 years, as you heard Leah say, that has really been a journey for us. We didn't always walk the walk or talk the talk inside of our own organization. And about 4 years ago, I really sort of had this experience where I did not want to meet Dorothy Height, who worked for the YWCA and was the first national director in terms of our racial equity work. And it's Dorothy Height, who's considered the grandmother of the civil rights era, who says, the YWCA has one imperative, and that is eliminating racism. And she said that 50 years ago, this past summer, was the summer of 1970. And 4 years ago, I knew I had this experience where I didn't want to meet Dorothy Height in heaven and have her say, what the hey? You had all that time sitting in that seat and you did not do the work. And so internally, you have to be able to recognize where you are not being explicit. Because when you're not explicit in a world, in a country where we are all socialized around racism, then the default becomes whiteness. The default becomes white-centeredness. And the default can, again, as we saw Dr. Kimora Jones's quote and definition of racism, creates an unfair advantage. And so you have to be explicit. And over the last 4 years, we've been able to literally step into our practices and our policies and our norms at the YWCA, looking at our job descriptions, looking at our onboarding, looking at our board bylaws, looking at the way just the fabric of how we do everything. We've certainly looked at assessments and done other pieces. We've used our 21-day challenge as a professional development tool to support our team around understanding racism. And we've really curated and cultivated within ourselves internally an appetite to root this out. And doing that work internally, strengthening ourselves internally, has really allowed us to strengthen our work externally. And as Leah said, in 2019, we hosted a summit with First Year Cleveland. 2 days, over 500 people attended each day. My YWCA sisters from all over the state were with us and had really sort of been tracking along as we were planning and understanding that we needed to declare racism a public health crisis. And so when COVID happened, our work to declare racism a public health crisis had already been in play in 2019. And then the tragedy of seeing, public lynchings and public murders again hit the headlines, and America saw it with fresh eyes. But this was not a new phenomenon. Lynchings in America date back to the 1600s. And early at the beginning of this year, I had an opportunity to be in Alabama. I went to Alabama for my own growth in this area. I too, like all of you, are always wanting to learn and to grow in this space. And went to Alabama with one of my colleagues and lots of students from Tri-C. We did the Civil Rights Trail and went to Selma, Montgomery, and Birmingham. And the Legacy Museum, Ben Stevenson's museum, also more commonly known, the Lynching Museum, was included in that trip. And again, like being in the slave castles. It's this amazingly powerful, stunning, it is holy, holy, holy ground. And it is solemn, and you are overwhelmed. Every marker represents two independent pieces of documentation. And as I'm at the Legacy Museum, I literally go to each place where I've lived in my life. I've lived in Dallas, Texas, and in Plano, right outside of Dallas, and I've lived in Fresno, California. I was born in Shasta County and Weaverville, all the way up north, and certainly Cuyahoga County, and and every place I went, there had been lynchings, and these are only the lynchings that are documented, and all of this traces back to we're less intelligent, we're genetically violent, we have a general disposition towards criminality. The way we act and function today is with that same belief system. And dismantling that belief system will take all of us. And it's scary to go down a road like declaring racism a public health crisis when there isn't a clear track and you're not sure what to do. It's important to begin by asking yourself, how does racism show up here? Where does racism show up here? Where does this connect back to slavery? What is this, and how can we begin to change it or explicitly identify ourselves in an anti-racist, right? So we know now that not just saying, hey, I'm not racist. It isn't enough because of the way racism lives in the very, very fabric of absolutely everything that we do. And, in closing, I would say that, I think for the YWCA for a long time, we too really believed that, dismantling racism, or that our work was in the program piece. And I think now, certainly my YWCA sisters in Ohio and we have tremendous clarity that the program piece is only it's a Band-Aid. It's a Band-Aid. The person is literally having a heart attack, and that is the Band-Aid approach. Is declaring racism a public health crisis or a public health emergency, is that the only thing? No. But it's a big, giant step. And we all have work to do in our own organizations and in our own lives. That work will strengthen our work and our voice and our commitment as we do the external work. And our organizations have a role to play as we move towards dismantling policy, understanding what and how and where policies can be changed to expose inequities, which we see in these disparities. When you look at the data, understand that you are looking at the impact of racism in health, in housing, in criminal justice, in education. That is literally the marker of racism on America. And I could go on and on. I am excited about where we're going and what we're doing and who's involved and how we are working together in a way that we certainly haven't seen in decades and decades and decades. And racism is so adaptive. And the human heart is deceitful. So we have to be diligent around the work that we do together to dismantle this thing for those that are coming behind us, for those children, for those young women on that video, for our future, for democracy, for America, for our strength. I believe that we can do this, that we must do this. And I believe that it will happen. And I'm excited that you all are social justice warriors with me in this fight to advance equity and eliminate racism. So thank you. And I want to be able to take questions. I'm hoping Leah's going to join me, and we can go from there.
Yes, we do have several questions. I'll start with our first one that was in the question and answer box from Pastor Penny of Perfecting Faith International Global Ministries. Would like to know, can you speak to how I may obtain this conference info in order to inform our youth group? So we will have a recording on this, but there's also, do you have anything specific on that you could offer in the direction?
Yeah, Pastor, you, in addition to this conversation, there's an amazing book by Jamar Tidsby, I believe, I'm drawing a blank on his name, who wrote The Color of Compromise. And it is a book that walks through the history of the church and racism. And The Color of Compromise is about the church's complicity in racism. And that is an amazing book. The founder of VeggieTales has done some amazing videos, The Holy Post, which you can find on YouTube. And that is an amazing resource for youth groups to be able to delve into as well. And I also want to say I recommended, I have this book. This is one of my favorite books by Ibram Kennedy, which is Stamped from the Beginning. And he has a book, Stamped from the Beginning is also, there's a young person's edition. I don't have that. I haven't read that, but I have read Kennedy's work and highly commend that to you. And so Stamped from the Beginning is done, and he does open up with Genesis and sort of walks through that understanding. And I also wanted to share Cast, which I know is going to be an upcoming book that will be an option for us in Youngstown in Northeast Ohio, that Mahoning Valley YWCA will lead us through. And this is by Isabel Wilkerson, and it is an amazing book. And Isabel also, as she talks about caste systems, she again points to the importance of a divine text, really, again, being hijacked, because we all know that it has been twisted to be able to achieve one's own desires, to inhumanely treat our fellow man. So those are my recommendations.
Thank you for recommending those books. We will be providing more information on those sessions to go over those. We have several questions about the clarification regarding the sons of Noah, wondering if it was the son Ham that was cursed, and then what do we do about that moving forward?
Yeah, yes, I believe it was Ham that was cursed, Noah's sons. And, 2 years ago, I think I went to the Museum of the Bible with my husband because I wanted to see the Bible that was used. They actually have a slave Bible, and all of or lots of the references to freedom are redacted out of that Bible, which is fascinating. So, I mean, it's a lot of, you have to pull out a lot of Genesis, you have to pull out a lot of Exodus, you have to pull out a lot of Leviticus and Numbers. And then of course, they're just, you have to think to yourself, well, how in the world? I mean, just so much of the Bible is sort of built on this, this concept of freedom. But there it is, that, somebody went to great pains to sort of, rewrite this work in order to manipulate and control people. And, and so we get the AME Church, the African Methodist Episcopalian Church, comes out of that system of sort of this separate way of worshiping, which at one time was together, and then separates. And of course, we know that for the most part today we do worship separately. I'm not sure I answered your question, but
I think part of that was, if it is considered prophecy, biblical prophecy, how do you move forward when that is in your heart of hearts, what you've been taught and believe?
Yes. Well, yeah, I think that's something you have to weed through. I mean, in Genesis 1, just Genesis 1, 2, and 3, we really see that God's intent was to create man in his own image. And in those verses is really sort of the explicit understanding that we are equal in his image. And slavery does exist in the Bible. There is biblical slavery. There's no question about that. But we have to remember that biblical slavery is really sort of it's time limited, and so you have this deep understanding that you are a slave for a period of time, and then you are released, and you are treated equal as a brother. And we see this also in the New Testament with Philemon, which is just one chapter and not often read. But Paul says, Paul tells the story of Philemon, and that this is a slave who is released who should be treated as my brother. And so there is the overwhelming evidence, whether you are in the Old Testament or the New Testament, is that we are created equal, and that there are periods of indentured servitude or inhumanity. And what happened in America was the systematic public policy to codify this relationship. And along those lines, as race came in, there are assigned, through what was called good science at the time, a sort of assigned characters, which still remain today. And we're constantly having to shake it off. When you think about the wage gap, the wage gap clearly goes back to, Black women sort of, we're going to pay them for their work. and so you can see the thread that exists today. It's important to keep tying those threads in, because they're clear as day once you start, digging in and understanding them. So I will leave it to your heart. And there are just so many ways to walk someone through to be able to see that we are all created equally.
Okay. From Deborah Flora, would you please comment on the story excerpt from the Chronicle of Philanthropy, Repairing the Frayed Social Fabric of the Nation in the Wake of a Highly Contentious Election Will Require a Focus in the Local Community Levels. Don't expect our national leaders to make it happen, said David Brooks, who helped found a national effort to bring people together. So could you comment on that? Are you familiar with that?
I really, we must do the work locally. And, the organizations that are on this call, I just want to encourage us. We are the community, and it's so important for us to be able to move through having these very difficult conversations. There is a real drive to sort of, even now, turn back to talking about diversity. People are sending me their diversity plans, and it's like, diversity is not going to get us where we need to go. We need to understand that we must face racism. We must talk racism. We must step into those uncomfortable conversations and expose what is there. That there is this unequal treatment, that there is this bias. Years ago we used to say stereotypes, whatever it is still the same thing. Racism exists. It exists on a personal level. It exists on a political level in our governments and in our companies. That photo of my father. We could name some engineering companies. We could name Fortune 500 companies, and many of their divisions look the same today. In fact, Lee and I had an opportunity to see some work coming out of Toledo last week, and they had an amazing graph sort of showing, the trajectory of white women in the workforce. And you see this growth trajectory as they move from entry level into, senior management, right? And of course, we know what white men looks like, but for Black men and for Black women, it's this thin, even no growth, no advancement there. And we have to keep our foot locally on the pedal, and we have to keep inviting people in. Everyone on this call is what I would, we are among we're the willing. We have an appetite, but we have to keep inviting folks into the dialogue and the discourse in order for us to be able to move forward. And we have to partner that with changing practice and policy. And so the combination of the two will help us arrive at a new place. It is not acceptable for Cleveland and Youngstown to be among the worst in the world for infant mortality based upon the color of the skin of the mother and the baby. We have to. There's nothing genetically wrong. We are not ill because of our Blackness. And Lee and I were talking earlier about Dr. Kamara Jones, which I commend you to her if you haven't seen her work. But she talks a lot and gives a allegory around the gardener and the soil. And in good soil, things thrive. But in poor soil, things do not thrive. And a number of things go into the poor soil. And we have to understand the toxicity of the soil, the trauma of the soil, and just the long history of poor soil. Even farmers know that they must rest the soil. They've got to give it nutrients again in order for it to give back and to thrive. And what we're looking at is just decades and hundreds of years in which Blacks have been asked to live in really poor soil.
I think we have time for one more question, and there's so many wonderful remarks. Everybody is very appreciative of your talk today. I could probably go on for another half hour with the questions, but we'll end with one from our friend Madonna Chisholm Pinkard, who says, racism, it seems when Black people suggest racism training education, we're accused of being racist. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, sister, this was my dad's battle. It was his dad's battle. It's my children's battle. And I think that what we're seeing more of are our sisters who don't look like me in the fight, and I think that is absolutely important. And I think it takes us together, finding common voices to partner with us because at the end of the day, I want people to hear, I want them to grow, I want them to learn. And I think at the YWCA, we work a lot on trust. We work a lot on really sort of building the relationship so that we can hear each other and we can grow together and we can create those win-wins. And that takes political savviness. And even in our workplaces, we need to be cognizant of the political savviness needed in order to move forward with this work. And training must come with real behavioral change. It's one thing that why we're so passionate about the 21-day challenge. I know Leah is a big fan of it as well, because it does allow for the heart to change. It is a behavioral change tool. It takes 21 days to create a new habit. And it's a really important tool to be able to share and use, across Ohio and across our organizations. There's just amazing, work that is out there. There was a incredible, did you see the PBS piece on driving while Black that gave the historical, so many of my team members who are on the call today watched that. We've had so many discussions. And I remember driving across country with my family in the early 70s from California to Colorado to visit my dad's sister, who was a nurse. And our car broke down in Utah. And my mother and my father had to hitchhike into town in order to get help. And my mother never said she was afraid, but my dad was gone for hours. She prayed out loud. And I can just remember the physical fear. And I hadn't thought about that story. And when I watched that, all the trauma of that came back to me in such a real, powerful, overwhelming, scared, afraid, as Dr. Nadine Burke says, the toxic stress level of the grizzly bear chasing after me. It was that powerful of a memory. So there are so many ways for us to be able to approach and invite and share and discuss beyond the training. It's a constant cultivation that we have to be in. And don't forget to take real action, to look at things that you've done. We've changed how we hire, the questions we ask, all of these things are there for you. You must do this work. You are the social justice warrior. You are the YWCA. Mahoning Valley is here for you to be able to walk with you, bounce ideas, talk about what they're doing. They're growing too. We're all in this together. And the more we can be transparent about what we share and learn and grow and fight, we can move forward together and love and love.
Oh, wonderful to end it on love. Margaret, thank you, my sister, my friend, for your wonderful remarks today. Thank you all for attending. We will be also promoting others that are doing work in the community. So if you have an event you'd like to share with us, we'll be glad to get it out there for you. We'll also be sending all of you a link to an evaluation so we can get your feedback on today's event and help us to plan for future events. So thank you all so much. Again, we just appreciate you, Margaret, and we will see you all next time. Thank you so much.
Love you, sister.